For nearly 6 years now, Zorian had been living in this endlessly repeating month. It felt longer, to be honest. So many things had happened, and his worldview had undergone such radical changes, that he felt it would only be right if the whole thing had taken place over a decade or more. It made him wonder how the original Zack would compare to the boy he had come to know. They seemed vaguely similar at first glance, but those were no doubt just surface similarities. There was no way that Zack had stayed the same over several decades. Zorian just hadn't known the boy all that well before the time loop and thus couldn't spot the differences. Nevertheless, Zorian had spent a bit over half a decade in the time loop, and in all that time he had never really sat down with his mother to have a chat about things. Some people would have been very ashamed about this, but not Zorian. Indeed, he felt that one of the really nice things about the time loop was that he could virtually eliminate his interaction with his parents. Now, for the first time in years, he was going to strike up a conversation with Mother, and it would be about Daimen. He hadn't thought he'd ever want his parents to talk more about his older brother, but life was funny like that sometimes. "Actually, this reminds me of something," Mother said. "Your father and I are going to Koth to visit Daimen." Oh good. He'd been waiting for her to mention their trip to Koth. Thankfully, this wasn't something he had to steer the conversation to. Despite her choice of words, the topic was clearly at the forefront of her mind. She found a way to bring it up in every single restart. "Well, that's a little sudden," Zorian commented lightly. "What brought this up?" If his mother was surprised by him showing actual interest in family matters, she didn't show it. "It's only proper for us to visit Daimen from time to time," she said in a lecturing tone. "It has been nearly a year since we've last seen each other. Family ties are important." Zorian said in a patronizing tone. "Wouldn't it make more sense for Daimen to visit you instead? Seems that would be way easier than you traveling all the way to Koth." "Well," she said, pausing a little. "You're probably right about that. But you know how driven Daimen is. He's been really fired up about whatever he's been looking for. There is no way he'd take a break right now, not even to visit his family." "I see," said Zorian. The old, bitter part of him knew that they would never have been so understanding if he had tried to do the same. No, had he ignored his family for nearly a year, missing all the family dinners and such, he would have never heard the end of it. But that wasn't helpful right now, so he pushed such thoughts away and focused on something else. "Since he won't come to you, you'll come to him." "Fair enough. Although, if this is a family meeting, how come you aren't making the rest of us take the trip with you? It's not much of a family reunion if more than half of it isn't even there." "How do you know we aren't making you come with us?" she asked curiously. Zorian paused for a moment. Crap, she hadn't actually mentioned that part yet, did she? Oh well, this was pretty easy to salvage. "What, you're going to stop me from going to the academy at the very last moment?" Zorian asked her with a raised eyebrow. "Or Fortov? Or drag Curiel around a completely alien country where she is liable to pick up 10 different exotic diseases in a matter of days?" "Actually, it's good that you've reminded me about Curiel dash," she began, only for him to cut her off almost immediately. "I'll do it," he said. She blinked in surprise, momentarily stunned into silence. "I beg your pardon," she asked. "You wanted to ask me if I would take Curiel with me to Syoria, right?" Zorian guessed. "I imagine this was why you even brought this topic up in the first place." "I'll do it. I'll take her with me to Syoria." "Yes." Curiel yelled, cunningly hidden just out of sight so she could eavesdrop on their conversation. Zorian rolled his eyes at her outburst, and even Mother felt the need to direct an exasperated look in Curiel's direction. Not that the little imp saw it, she was still hiding and pretending she wasn't spying on them. "That was surprisingly easy," Mother commented, shifting her attention back to him. "I know Curiel has been a little difficult lately. I'm glad you can see beyond that." "Yes, well, now that we've gotten that out of the way, we can go back to discussing your actual reasons for rushing to Koth so suddenly," Zorian said. Mother gave him an appraising look. Why do you care about this so much? She asked. Not that I'm complaining about you taking interest in family matters. In fact, I think it's a positive thing. However, you can't deny that this is somewhat unlike you. And you can't deny this trip is somewhat unusual, Zorian immediately shot back. You're leaving Curiel in my hands for at least 2 months and probably more, which you probably don't like at all. I'm sure you'll do fine, she interjected. And you're leaving your company without proper leadership in the middle of the summer, which I'm sure is driving father more than a little crazy, finished Zorian, ignoring her comment. It wasn't that their business couldn't survive without them for a few months. The company his parents had built was long past the phase where they needed to get personally involved in every little detail or business deal. So long as no crisis popped up, they could easily leave the whole thing to their subordinates for a couple of months. But what if there was a crisis? There was no way his parents were not thinking about this and worrying. Especially father, who seemed to think most of his workers were either lazy or incompetent. That is, if Zorian had interpreted his father's random grumbling correctly over the years. Your father has indeed been a little hesitant to leave the company to its own devices for so long, Mother admitted. But it's... She hesitated, visibly considering whether to tell him the truth or not. Not for the first time, Zorian wondered if he should just use his mental powers and read her thoughts. He really didn't want to. Even though they didn't get along very well, there was just something very amoral about intruding on his mother's thoughts like that. It's what? He asked slowly. You're very pushy today, she remarked, an unhappy frown on her face. You keep criticizing me for not thinking about the family and our reputation, Zorian said, not able to keep a flash of annoyance out of his voice. Yet now that you clearly have some kind of family emergency on your hands, you are keeping me in the dark about it. I think I have the right to be a little rude. It's not a family emergency, she said, rubbing her forehead in frustration. Not like you're thinking, anyway. It's just... She sighed, deeply and heavily, like she was carrying some kind of great weight on her shoulders. Can you cast some of those privacy wards that prevent sound from leaving the area? This is not something that I want Curiel to hear. Zorian nodded and promptly erected a 2-layer barrier, one to block out sound from leaving the room and the other to prevent anyone from stepping foot in it without exerting a considerable amount of physical force. Just in case Curiel decided to be a bit bolder than usual. It's done, Zorian told Mother. Now what's this about? Daimen is getting married, she finally admitted. Zorian stared at her for a second, trying to process that. What? That was the big secret? Okay, so he could understand why his parents would consider this to be big news. However, he expected them to be happier about it. The way Mother behaved, he would have thought that somebody had died, not that a wedding had been announced. I don't understand, Zorian admitted after a few seconds. Why is this such a bad thing? If I remember correctly, you even made some pointed noises to him that he wasn't that young anymore and that he should think about settling down. Is there something wrong with the fiancé? The girl is fine, Mother sighed. She's from a powerful family of mages that are movers and shakers in their state. She's basically local nobility. So he's marrying into nobility, then? Zorian asked. Funny, I would have expected you to be ecstatic about that. Mother gave him a rather unamused look. No. You don't like the fact that he's marrying into nobility? Zorian asked, baffled. He honestly didn't understand why Mother disapproved of this so much. This sounded like something she'd be thrilled about. It isn't a good thing that she's local nobility. That only makes things worse, Mother explained. Bad enough that he wants to marry some distant foreigner when there are so many perfectly good local girls he could go for. Daughters of influential families that would be happy to forge ties with us in exchange for getting a genius mage of his caliber into their fold. But never mind that. I could stomach this if this was just random girl he picked up in Koth and brought home. But this girl, she's practically a princess. There is absolutely no way she would agree to move here to Altazia with Daimen. Instead, it will be him staying in Koth with her. Ah, Zorian said, finally understanding what the issue was. If Daimen married this girl and remained permanently in Koth, his parents would gain nothing from this. Even though he would be marrying into nobility, it would be very distant, foreign nobility. That would only give his parents some mild bragging rights, but none of the practical benefits that marrying some influential family in Eldamar, or at least in a country on the same continent, would. Plus, if Daimen remained in Koth, his parents would only ever see their favorite son, and his new family, once in a blue moon. The distance between Koth and Eldamar was not something casually crossed. So, Zorian said. I'm guessing you've already tried to talk him out of this through your letters. Yes, Mother said. We wrote to him at length as to why this is a poor idea. No matter how amazing he thinks this girl is, he could do so much better here in Eldamar. But Daimen didn't listen to you? Zorian surmised, not without some schadenfreude at their predicament. He said he loves her, she said, shaking her head sadly. He won't budge an inch on the matter. He won't even delay the marriage, much less cancel it. Keeps insisting she's perfect and that he can't let the opportunity slip away. It's too sudden. Why won't he listen to me? Zorian clacked his tongue. He didn't know why she was so surprised. Love always made people unreasonable, and Daimen had had his parents doting on him for as long as Zorian could remember. Why would he give up what was apparently the love of his life just because his parents didn't approve? That said, and Zorian couldn't believe he was thinking this, he actually agreed with Daimen here. What right did their parents have to get in between him and his new fiancée? It was ultimately his decision to make. Though admittedly, it was also his parents' right to drop everything and go all the way to Koth to try and convince him otherwise in person. I suppose you think that going there and trying to convince him face to face will be more effective than letters, Zorian surmised. You can never be as convincing in a letter as you can when being physically there in front of someone, Mother said. But I don't know whether that will be enough, that's all. We still have to try. I know he's young and in love, but he's making a big mistake and he needs to know that. Zorian hummed. All right. I'm not going to get involved with this, and I'm sure you don't expect me to. Thank you for explaining things, at least. Don't spread this around, she warned. I'm telling you this because I know you can keep a secret. There is still a chance we can set this right. All right, agreed Zorian easily. Quick question, then. Do you know what Daimen has been working on in Koth and where he is right now? No, he was always very secretive about that. He was worried someone would intercept his letters and beat him to his prize. The world of treasure hunters is very competitive, from what I hear. We agreed he would come and pick us up in Jasuka once we arrived there. Zorian nodded. About what he expected, really. It made sense for his parents to arrive in Jasuka, since the city was the main entrance port for ships entering the Koth region from the north, and it made sense for Daimen to go and meet them there. Sadly, this meeting was too late for Zorian's purposes, so he needed some clue with which he could track his eldest brother down. Like, say, the identity of this fiancée of his. Do you know the name of this girl he wants to marry? Zorian asked. Or maybe the name of this noble family of theirs and which country it is from. I'm curious. Her name is Orissa Siki Teramachula, of the Teramachula family, Mother said. They are from the state of Harameo, wherever that is. Supposedly they're very distinctive, because their family magic is based around these magical bees that they cultivate. Bees? Zorian asked curiously. Yes. They breed several species of magical bees and use their secret family magic to control and direct them. They're supposedly very versatile, Mother explained. They produce some sort of extremely valuable honey, they can be deadly in battle and they're very good at tracking things down. It's this last thing that led Daimen to contact them. He hired their best trackers for his mission, and the daughter of the family head came along with the group. One thing led to another and, Well, now we have this situation on our hands. Hopefully her family is as unenthusiastic about this as we are and we can get their help with this. Ha! It would seem that Daimen was finally going to learn how unpleasant their parents could really be when they disapproved of their children's choices. In any case, this was probably already enough information to track down Daimen. This Terramachula family sounded like they would be trivially easy to locate, and they probably knew where Daimen was. Still, it might not hurt to see if he could get anything else out of Mother. Maybe Daimen let something important slip through in his letters. He opened his mouth to ask another question, only to get interrupted by a knock at the door. Oh right. Ilsa was here to talk to him. Mother motioned for him to go open the door, and Zorian obliged her. Continuing the conversation would have to wait until he dealt with the academy representative. Svim's home was currently host to a very unusual group. Zorian, Zack, Svim, Alanik, Kale and Taven were all gathered in Svim's living room, poring over the various documents Zack and Zorian had collected over the restarts. Everyone who was aware of the time loop was there. Zorian would have normally left Kale and Taven out of this meeting. Kale because he had told him to keep secrets from him in subsequent restarts, and Taven because she never fully believed in the time loop anyway, but Svim and Alanik insisted that they should be involved with things this time. This wasn't something Svim and Alanik usually did, but Zorian had come to expect these kinds of sudden requests from them lately. Ever since they had started leaving messages and research notes to their future selves via Zorian, their actions tended to vary a lot from restart to restart. Zorian saw no reason to refuse the request, so Kale and Taven got to join them this time. Unlike everyone else, Zorian didn't bother reading any of the documents. There was no need to. He was, after all, the one who had taken all the various notes and records and turned them into the relatively concise reports they were currently reading. Well, he and his simulacrums, anyway. He tended to delegate this kind of work to his copies these days. He just had to remember to read through their finished work at least once, or else they would try to sneak things in as a form of silent protest against being given boring chores to do. But really, what did he have them for if not so he could delegate the boring, time-consuming stuff to them? Well, that is good news about the Abasin Gate, Zack said, leafing through the information they gathered on the structure in the previous restart. I was all but sure that Quatakikl had stuck a human soul somewhere in there to make the gate. I mean, even the Bakura gates require some sort of spirit to function like they do. Bakura gates open portals all on their own, though, Zorian said. The Abasin gates don't. They just keep a portal someone else created open indefinitely. Yes, it's hard to see what a soul in there would do, except maybe provide a power source, Alanik spoke up. It's not like sticking any random soul in there would allow it to open dimensional passages on its own. I guess if you added a soul of a willing mage in there, like Sudamir did with his wife Dash. Kale made a very sour face at the reminder about that. He didn't have a very high opinion of Sudamir's act of love, and flat out said so earlier. It didn't help that Sudamir had pretty much hunted down all of Kale's friends and would have likely done the same to the boy if he hadn't been scouted out by the academy by then. Then maybe you could improve the efficiency of the structure or something, Alanik finished. Otherwise, there would be little point to it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining, Zack said. I mean, if the Abasin Gate is just a spell stabilization frame made out of exotic materials and spell formula, that means we can copy their design easily enough, right? Zorian? I'm not sure something this intricate and advanced deserves to be called just anything, Zorian remarked. As for recreating it, well, if it were just you and me working on this, I'd say it would take us years to figure out how to reproduce it. But since we'll be using the whole army of experts approach we used in the previous restart, it will still take at least a year, but probably not more than one. Still a year. Zack whined, visibly disappointed. Why? The short time during which we have access to the gate is really hampering us, Zorian explained, clacking his tongue unhappily. We may have an army of experts, but they only have a couple of hours before the end of the restart to examine the gate. There is only so much they can do in such a short time. Why not just attack the base before the end of the restart? Taven asked. Is this Quada-Kickle really that unbeatable? Yes, Zack and Zorian answered in unison. Okay, no need to pile up on me, she grumbled. And is there no time during which he's absent from Scioria or something? Zorian was just about to explain why that wouldn't work when he remembered something. He reached for a nearby stack of papers and started quickly leafing through a timeline of the invasion he and Zack had painstakingly made. A definitive timeline was, of course, completely impossible. Things changed often, depending on what Zack and Zorian did in any particular restart. However, certain things seemed very resistant to change, and virtually always happened on schedule if they didn't specifically try to disrupt them. He was sure he remembered something about Here, Zorian said triumphantly, pointing at one of the paragraphs. At the beginning of the third week of the restart, Quada-Kickle has a tendency to return to Oquin-Abesa and stay there for 3 whole days. So long as we don't disrupt the invasion too badly until then, he's likely to do just that in this restart too. Then, if we manage to seize the Abasan base at the very start of this period, we will have 3 whole days to study the gate without interruption. That's a big if, Zack pointed out. You're talking about attacking the base while it's fully staffed and defended. Trust me, that's very different than taking out those bunch of incompetents that loiter around the base during the invasion itself. And you're talking about doing it without giving them enough time to raise the alarm and summon Quada-Kickle back. Or get reinforcements from Sudamir's mansion, for that matter. Yeah, said Zorian thoughtfully. Alanic soldiers alone aren't going to cut it this time. We're going to need to hire Iranian mercenaries if this is ever going to work. I'm pretty sure I can find a web that would be interested if we offer enough payment. And Sudamir? Alanic asked. Oh, that one is easy, Zorian said. He's still a mayor of Nyazov Dveri. We just create a big enough disturbance in the town and wait for him to show up, as he surely must. Then we kill his bodyguards and kidnap him in broad daylight. There was a brief silence as everyone gave him strange looks. What? Zorian said defensively. You've got a better idea? You've become a scary person, Zorian, Taven remarked. Why kidnap? Alanic asked. Why not just assassinate him? He cryptically hinted that he was very hard to kill when I spoke to him, Zorian said. I don't know what magic he used for that, but it's possible that just killing him wouldn't work. So I figured it was safer to just put him to sleep and keep him that way for as long as necessary. Well, I at least approve of this course of action, Alanic said. If nothing else, this will give me a chance to interrogate Sudamir once he has been captured. I note we've never really done that properly in any of the past restarts. Yeah, it was never really a priority, and the man's plans were all pretty crazy anyway, Zorian shrugged. Crazy or not, he clearly had plenty of talent in magic, Kale said. You shouldn't just limit yourself to questioning him about his crimes and links to Oquin-Abesa. You should interrogate him for everything he knows about necromancy and other magic as well. Unsurprisingly, this made him the new target of everyone's strange looks, much like Zorian had been earlier. Look, Kale said, trying to sound calm. I probably hate this monster more than anyone in this room. Chances are that a portion of his knowledge comes from the very people I knew. People he killed and, in all probability, whose souls he interrogated for secrets. Magical and otherwise. But that's precisely why you should do the same to him. He struggled for a moment to find the right word. Just, Alanic offered quietly. Appropriate, Kale corrected. It's appropriate for him to suffer a similar fate. Fitting. It took another 2 hours for them to create a basic outline for a plan of attack on the Abasan base. The biggest surprise to Zorian was that Taven wanted to participate in the fighting. Specifically, she wanted to join the soldiers and battle mages that Alanic would be mustering for the operation. Alanic provisionally agreed to this, though he told her he would throw her out of the battle group immediately if she proved incapable of following the chain of command. The tiny flinch she did after hearing that told Zorian that she'd likely had problems with that in the past, but she agreed with his condition anyway. In the end, the meeting was dismissed and everyone went their own way except for Zorian, who stayed behind to talk to Svim about something. So, Svim began. "We're alone, Mr. Kaczynski. What is it that you wanted to talk to me about that you didn't want the others to overhear?" "First," Zorian said, taking out a notebook out of his jacket pocket, "take a look at this." The notebook was, of course, the very list of people to interrogate for secrets that Svim had given him in one of the previous restarts. The one that had caused him so much self-doubt and worrying. Svim carefully started leafing through it, his frown deepening ever further as time went by. Zorian patiently waited for him to finish, not saying a word. "I suppose I'm the one who gave you this," Svim said, giving Zorian a questioning look. Zorian nodded. "I see. Then should I assume you're here because you've already gone through the entire list and now need more names?" Svim stared first at Zorian, and then at the notebook in his hands, staying silent for a while. Finally, he wordlessly handed the notebook back to Zorian. "That," Svim decided, "is relieving to hear." Zorian blinked in surprise at the statement. "I don't know whether my past self would agree with me." "Probably not, if he gave you that list," Svim continued. "And I can definitely see the logic in giving you that list, even though I don't like it. All that said, I don't understand what the purpose of this talk is. If you don't need more names, why did you show me that book?" "I have decided I won't be going after these people," Zorian said. And what a load off his chest that was, too. Not the way your past iteration had urged me to do. I'm not sure whether to praise you for your ethics or berate you for being too soft to do what has to be done, Svim grumbled, shaking his head slightly. Then again, the way you phrase that makes me think you still have some sort of designs for the list. I'm guessing that's where I come in, yes? See, the idea is this: I want you to talk to these people and try to get their secrets yourself, Zorian told him bluntly. He paused for a moment. And then share these secrets with me, of course. Mr. Kaczynski, Svim told him, if I could get these people to share their secrets with me like that, don't you think I would have already done so? Not for all of them, Zorian pointed out. Some of them are clearly on the list because you thought I might be interested in what they had to offer, but you probably don't care for their specialties. I doubt you even tried to trade for what they have to offer. That much is true, Svim admitted. As for the rest, how much did you really offer them for their life's work? Zorian asked. I'm always fair in my dealings, Mr. Kaczynski, Svim said with a frown. Yes, but what if you gave them an outrageous offer? Zorian smiled. The collected secrets of dozens of mages. More money than they'd ever seen in their life. Rare materials that cannot be obtained on the open market. A chance to hire a group of archmages for a task. That sort of thing. Svim raised an eyebrow at him. If you can offer all that, why do you need me? It will still sound rather ridiculous, Svim pointed out. People will think I've gone mad. Well, more than they already do, anyway. Don't worry, your reputation will be restored at the end of every restart, Zorian told him. How very comforting, Svim deadpanned. They were both silent for a while as Svim considered the idea. There is some merit to it, Svim eventually admitted. Some of these people, I don't think there is anything I could offer them to share their findings with me. Most, though, probably have their price, if one were willing to go high enough, and the offer looked credible. And on that note, are you sure you can really deliver what you offer? Take money, for example. I'm not sure you understand what kind of sums are exchanged between high-level mages on deals like these. What sounds like an outrageous sum to you might look like pocket change to them. Zorian didn't try to explain. He simply reached into his pocket and handed Svim a bank check he had made for the occasion. Svim glanced at it and immediately raised his eyebrows at the sum written on the piece of paper. That's a lot of zeros, Svim said after a short pause. No, Mr. Chow, Zorian said with a toothy smile. That is just pocket change. The coming week was a relatively busy one, with many things happening. An invasion of the Abasin base beneath Scioria was being organized, the Silent Doorway adepts were being convinced that time travel was real and that they should give them access to their Bakura Gate and associated experts again. Some changes were being planned for their tour of Altasia's various black rooms, and the plot to convince various experts to part with their closely guarded secrets was slowly going forward. Thankfully, it was no longer just Zorian working alone on all these things, as it once was, so this kind of workload was easy enough to maintain. That said, all of this was mostly irrelevant to Simulacrum number 2, whose job was simply to go to school and then disappear at the end of the day. Strangely enough, number 2 didn't mind his task. He knew that his predecessors had been rather unenthusiastic about their task, but he personally found it just to his liking. Maybe it was because the original had created him right after he had finished another negotiation session with the Silent Doorway adepts, but he felt this sort of relaxing task was just what he needed. Still, actually paying attention to classes was out of the question, so he picked up a couple of advanced books to read during lectures and breaks. It was during one of the breaks that he found Nialu watching over his shoulder curiously. "What?" he asked. He was rather surprised. Really, this wasn't like in the previous restart, where the earlier simulacrums ended up secretly befriending her during their short lives. He was sure of it. So why exactly was she taking interest in him and his reading choices? "Why are you reading dictionaries of Zlotic languages?" she asked curiously. "Oh. Right. Of course she would be interested in that. She was from Zlotic herself, after all." He had found out a fair amount about Nialu in the previous restart, partially because Nialu herself felt the need to tell him about herself and partially because he had needed to reconstruct what his simulacrums had done by subtly questioning people and reading their thoughts. Nialumamanu Iljader, Nialu for short, was a daughter of a regular, but very wealthy house from Contamar, one of the bigger Icosian successor states on the Zlotic coast. The darker, bronze-colored skin of hers hinted at it, but that kind of complexion was also common in southern Altazia and the Shirvan archipelago, and thus not a dead giveaway. The blue, tattoo-like markings on her cheeks and forehead were the signature trait of her house, and nobody knew if they were merely cosmetic or held some kind of secret Iljader family magic. For Nialu to travel all the way from Zlotic to Eldamar in order to study magic was rather unusual, to say the least. It wasn't like Zlotic didn't have plenty of prestigious academies of its own. It was once the heartland of the Icosian Empire after all, and though the cataclysm hurt the region badly, that still counted for something. Nonetheless, Nialu's father decided to send her all the way to Eldamar for her magical education. Officially it was because Scioria's academy was the world's most renowned magical academy and he wanted nothing but the very best for his daughter, but rumor had it she had been involved in some kind of scandal back home and he wanted her out of people's sight for a while. Sending her to a distant but prestigious magical academy was probably a good solution in his book. That was just a rumor, though, and even if Nialu was here in unofficial exile, one certainly couldn't tell that by her behavior. She seemed quite happy to be in Scioria, and never gave the slightest amount of indication that she was bitter about her family or home. It was possible that the rumors were just rubbish in this case and that she had just really wanted to go to a foreign country for her education and her father couldn't bear to refuse her request. Well, no matter. Not his business anyway. As for him reading Zlotic dictionaries, well, he was actually trying to make himself somewhat useful by helping Simulacrum number 1, who was steadily making his way to Koth right now. He had been in mental contact with his fellow Simulacrum for a while now, and while the dictionaries he was reading were kind of outdated, it was better than nothing. Of course, he couldn't really tell that to Nialu. "I was thinking of visiting Zlotic once I graduate from the academy," he told her instead. "Really?" she gasped. "Oh, that's wonderful. Trust me, it's a beautiful place. You should visit my place when you do. I can give you a tour of the city and tell you where to go if you want to see something interesting." Now that was an interesting idea. Didn't Zack say that it was easy to convince Nialu that time travel was real? Maybe they should recruit her as a guide when they went looking for the piece of the key that was supposedly lost in Zlotic. She probably wouldn't be able to help them too much, but she could at least make sure they didn't make any major social blunders and act as a translator for them while they gathered their bearings. And maybe put in a good word for them to her house, so they could hopefully tap into their contacts throughout the region. I'll keep that in mind, Zorian said. Say, do you think you could help me translate a few things? I have this list of phrases that I got from my friend who has been to Zlotic, but I can't seem to find them in the books. Once Zorian's simulacrum had finally reached Koth again, actually tracking down Daimen proved to be quite easy. Admittedly, this was only because he had managed to get the identity of his fiancée out of Mother. Turns out, Daimen was not quite as driven as Mother imagined him to be. Instead of ceaselessly pursuing whatever goal he came to Koth for, he was taking a bit of a break to spend time with his girl at the Terramachula family estate. Well, considering he had been doing that for several weeks now, a bit was probably an understatement. Anyway, all Zorian had to do was talk to a high-ranking member of the house, ask him where Daimen was, lift the information straight from his mind when he claimed he didn't know anything regarding the matter, and then make his way to the place with Zack in tow. Thus it was that the two of them found themselves waiting in front of the entrance to the Terramachula estate, stubbornly insisting that they wanted to talk to Daimen and ignoring the guards who were equally stubborn in claiming they'd never seen the man in their life. In all honesty, Zorian was kind of amazed they hadn't tried to violently get rid of them yet. He knew that houses back in Eldamar tended to be a bit trigger-happy when faced with visitors who couldn't take the hint. Though if they did, Zack and Zorian were entirely capable and willing to take them down and then keep doing the same to any reinforcements the house sent their way. Maybe they could sense that somehow. Eventually, a rather severe-looking middle-aged woman in white and orange clothing arrived to see what the disturbance was. She said her name was Alana, but she made no mention of what her position in the house was and what sort of authority she was wielding. "You say you are Damon's younger brother?" she asked with an arched eyebrow. Alana actually spoke grammatically perfect Icosian, unlike most people they found in Koth, though her accent was pretty thick. "Yes, Zorian Kaczynski." "You can show him this as proof," said Zorian, handing her a rolled-up painting that he had shamelessly stolen from Damon's room back in Siren. The painting depicted 3 female students from Damon's year at the academy, scantily dressed and posing suggestively. He had supposedly gotten that painting as a gift from the girls in question, and always kept it displayed prominently in his room, ignoring Mother's objection that it was obscene. The woman slowly and dramatically unfurled the painting, stoically scrutinized the contents with a raised eyebrow, and then gave him a mildly amused look. "I see," she said. "If nothing else, you seem to have a similar sense of humor as he does. I'll be sure to show this to him. I'm sure there is an interesting story behind it." "Oh, absolutely," Zorian said with a sunny grin. "I'm sure he'd love to tell you all about it." About 15 minutes later, Alana returned with Daimen in tow. It had been a while since Zorian had last seen his brother, but he hadn't changed much in the meantime. He was still the same tall, handsome guy with a muscular, athletic build and a confident swagger. Zorian would recognize him just about anywhere. Zorian had changed a lot since their last meeting, however. He had become good enough at magic to notice that Daimen had discreetly cast a divination spell at him to confirm he really was Zorian and not a disguised impostor. He had gotten good enough at his mental powers to immediately tell when he was in the presence of another psychic individual. He closed his eyes momentarily. Daimen was psychic. Of course. The one thing that Zorian was somewhat special at, and Daimen had to have it too. To tell the truth, though, he had somewhat been expecting it. It would certainly explain where that incredible social sense and persuasiveness of his had come from. Even as a child, Daimen could wade through social situations that even adult men would struggle at. How good was Daimen at controlling his gift, though? Zorian felt an urge to send a telepathic probe at him to check, but restrained himself. Maybe later. The situation was still a little tense right now, no sense in making himself even more suspicious. Also, if Daimen was open and had some measure of control over it, then he should have very much noticed that Zorian was like him. Why hadn't he said anything to him or his parents? Yeah, he definitely needed to confront him about this at some point. Zorian? Daimen said. Is that really you? Who else could I be? Zorian shot back. I know we haven't seen each other in a while, but have you really forgotten what your little brother looked like already? Daimen laughed awkwardly. No, of course not. It's just that this is very unexpected. Shouldn't you be in school or something? I should, Zorian admitted. But I decided to take a trip to Koth instead. Then I remembered you're already here and thought it would only be polite to drop by and say hi. Ah-ha, Daimen said. He gave him a measuring look. Tell me honestly, are you here on our parents' behalf? No, Zorian said, shaking his head. So you're not going to try and get in between me and Orisa? He asked. No, why would I, said Zorian. I'm happy for you. You're on your own when it comes to dealing with mother and father, though. You little brat, Daimen growled. Then why the hell did you pick that of all things as your proof of identity, It was a lovely painting, Alana commented stoically beside him. You must have been very popular in your school days, Mr. Kaczynski. Daimen ignored her comment in favor of focusing on Zorian. It sure seems like you're trying to get me in trouble here, is what I'm saying, he told Zorian. All I know about how to properly treat a brother I learned from you, brother dearest, Zorian said with a sickly smile. Oh? Alana asked. It sounds like you have some fascinating stories. Yeah, there are some nice ones, Zorian said. My personal favorite is when he thought it would be funny to constantly lock his little brother out of the house for hours on end. Actually, I just wanted the house all for myself, and you didn't want to go out and play outside like a normal kid, Daimen pointed out. Besides, I actually paid a price for that one. Yes, that's why I said it was my personal favorite, Zorian said. What exactly happened? Zack asked, causing Daimen and Alana to truly focus on him for the first time since the conversation started. He had been uncharacteristically quiet up until this moment, just observing the interaction from the sidelines and not saying anything. Zorian learned how to pick locks just so he could enter the house again, that's what, Daimen explained with annoyance. I mean, what kind of kid does that? And then some stupid police officer that had no idea he was trying to break into his own house sees him and arrests him for burglary. Man, was mother pissed about that when she found out. At both of us, really, but especially me since I was older and was supposed to be watching him instead of chasing him out of the house to do my own thing. Perfectly understandable, Alana commented. Yeah, I was a bit of a brat as a kid, Daimen said dismissively. Who wasn't? Anyway, come inside, you two. I must say, it's pretty impressive that you were able to travel all the way here from Eldamar. Pretty irresponsible too, Alana added from beside him. Well yeah, but I'm the last person who can lecture people about that, Daimen said. Man, compared to some of the stuff I did when I was their age, this is nothing. Alana raised an eyebrow at him. Fumbled Daimen, before rounding back at Zack and Zorian. And what the hell are you two waiting for? A written invitation? Get inside already before I dig myself an even deeper hole. I swear, this just isn't my day. With that, Daimen turned towards the actual building of the estate and marched towards it, trusting them to follow after him. With a careless shrug and a smile at a job well done, Zorian followed after him. Zorian had to admit he was somewhat surprised at the way the Taramacula family treated him and Zack. They clearly knew about Damon's family not approving of his relationship with Orisa, and the two of them made a spectacle of themselves upon arrival too. Zorian fully expected them to be wary of them, even unfriendly. Instead, the moment Daimen had confirmed Zorian was really who he said he was, they treated them both like honored guests. They summoned what must have been half of the whole extended family to greet them, introduced them to many of these people personally, gave them a brief tour of the place and offered to get Zorian something to drink at least 3 times before they accepted that he wasn't thirsty. That kind of reception made Zorian more than a little uncomfortable. He knew they were just being polite, and that all these smiles and pleasantries weren't very genuine, but he simply wasn't used to that kind of treatment. It didn't help that very few of the Terramachula spoke Icosian, which made it hard for Zorian to make himself understood. He only knew a few words in the local language, most of which were colorful local curses that his simulacrum had felt the need to include in his report for some reason, but people around him insisted on trying to talk to him anyway. Normally, this would be Zorian's clue to start peering into people's surface thoughts in order to decipher what they wanted from him. This wouldn't totally solve the problem of differing languages, since people's thoughts were in no way completely divorced from the language they spoke, but it would help. However, being too liberal with mind magic in a gathering of mages was a recipe for disaster. The situation, I guess. Are you sure they weren't just bitter their daughter chose to marry some foreign commoner and wanted to scare you off? Zorian asked curiously. Nah, I'm pretty sure they're pleased with her choice, Daimen said, sounding completely unconcerned. The local politics still makes my head spin every time I try to understand it, but the Terramachula have thoroughly solidified their position in the local scene. What they want most right now is powerful mages on their side, and well, I don't want to brag too much, but I'm kind of amazing. The only amazing thing about you is your ego, Zorian muttered under his breath. Daimen either didn't hear him or chose to ignore the comment. Well, I'll be honest with you and admit they would have preferred if I married one of their less prominent family members, Daimen said. Someone who wasn't so close to the main branch of the family. But I made it clear to them right away that this wasn't going to happen. I wasn't after Orissa's hand because I coveted their status and influence, I was after her because I loved her. It was either Orissa or nothing. Zorian considered asking Daimen what exactly was so amazing about Orissa, but decided he didn't actually care about the answer that much and stayed silent. Eventually, they reached their destination, a humble little building that looked like somewhat disrespectful accommodations for a person who was soon to marry into the Terramachula family. However, Zorian knew from talking to Alana that this wasn't the actual housing the Terramachula assigned to Daimen. He had a spacious room in the central building, one much more fitting for someone like him, it was just that he mostly chose not to use it. He spent most of his time here, in this out-of-the-way guest building, which had been assigned to him as his own private workshop after he complained that his assigned room wasn't secure enough to do his work in. Daimen ushered them inside the building, which was overflowing with maps, strange devices, and what appeared to be old artifacts recovered from gods nowhere. Don't touch anything, Daimen warned them. I'll kill you if you break something. Zorian knew it was just a stupid expression, but he couldn't help but imagine Daimen actually trying to kill the two of them and eventually realizing what he had gotten himself into. It put a sunny smile on his face. Oh, how glorious that would be. I don't like that smile, Daimen noted. Seriously Zorian, don't touch anything. This is work-related. I'm just messing with you, Zorian said, shaking his head. We'll leave your things alone, no need to worry. How is your expedition faring, anyway? Daimen collapsed on his chair with a long-suffering sigh, snatching a clay figurine of a bearded man off the table and staring at it for a few seconds. It's going, he said, eventually. Very informative. I'm close to finding it, I know I am, but I just can't seem to zero in on the actual location. I don't understand. We combed through the whole region and I know it's the correct region but everything is just. He shook his head and returned the figurine back to the table. Anyway, I'm taking a bit of a break right now, Daimen said. I figured it might clear my head a bit. Let me see things with a fresh perspective and all. But enough about me, let's talk about you. I've been wondering how did the two of you get here so fast? I don't know about you Zach, but Zorian couldn't have possibly just disappeared from home until after our parents went on their own journey to Koth. That leaves not a lot of time to actually get here. Zack and Zorian shared a look between each other. The two of them had debated what to tell Daimen about their goals and situation for a while, and the general conclusion was that they had no real option besides flat-out telling him the truth. Zorian didn't have a very high opinion of his brother, but Daimen was anything but stupid, and he knew Zorian personally. Not very well, but still. There was little doubt in Zorian's mind that Daimen would immediately see through any stupid story they might concoct about their visit. And in Zorian's experience, Daimen wasn't the type to quietly accept that sort of thing. They needed his full support, and the only way to impress the gravity of the situation upon him was to tell him about the time loop and their need for the key. Hopefully Daimen would be less aggravating to convince than, say, silent doorway adepts. "We opened a gate and stepped through it," Zorian eventually said. Daimen gave him a weird look. "A gate? As in, a dimensional passage?" he asked. "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "We created a portal straight from Eldamar to here in Koth." "You're saying nonsense, but you look completely serious," Daimen noted. "Either your acting has really gotten good or you're taking me for an idiot." "Zorian, if you're going to lie to me, at least check things beforehand to make things at least slightly plausible. Do you have any idea how hard it is to cast the gate spell?" "Oh yes," Zorian nodded seriously. "Took me a while to get the hang of it." "I'm sure," Daimen rolled his eyes. "I mean, you mastered the spell so well you can apparently open the doorway all the way from Altazia to southern Mycena. How does that even work, by the way?" "Well, first I made a simulacrum and sent it to Koth," Zorian began. "Oh, so you can make simulacrums too? Way to go, brother, you sure are a prodigy," Daimen praised mockingly. "Then, when my copy arrived here, we coordinated with each other to open the passage between our two locations," Zorian continued, ignoring his jab. "With two casters working on the spell at both ends of the passage, distance was not an issue." "That's," started Daimen, and then stopped and hummed thoughtfully to himself for a few seconds. "Okay, I think that could actually work. Congratulations, I guess. At least one part of your story holds water. It's still silly though, because you cannot possibly cast either of those two spells." "Hell, I can't cast either of them, so how could you?" Zorian was just about to respond, but Zack was faster. "What if we prove it to you?" he asked. "Prove it to me?" Daimen asked incredulously. "And how do you propose to do that? Opening another gate to Eldamar?" "Of course," Zorian nodded. "Seeing is believing. Nothing we could say would be as convincing as just showing you the truth. Fortunately, I left another simulacrum back home, so we can open a portal there whenever I want." "Zorian, there is taking a joke too far, you know," Daimen sighed. "It costs you nothing to humor us for a bit," Zack pointed out. "At worst you get to watch Zorian make a fool out of himself for a bit." Daimen considered this for a second and then chuckled for a moment. "Yeah, you have a point there," Daimen said, grinning. "Jerks, the both of them. So should I open a portal right here, then?" Zorian asked innocently. "Since I obviously can't do it, it shouldn't be a problem, right?" "No way," Daimen told him. "I'm not risking my workshop just so you could prove your point." Zorian grinned at him. "Annoying brat," Daimen grumbled. "Alright, whatever. I have no idea of what you two are up to, but I'll play along for now. In return, though, I want your promise that you'll tell me why you're here afterwards. Why you're really here, that is, not another bullshit story." "Deal," Zorian said, agreeing to the request with ease. He was going to do that anyway, so it cost him nothing to promise such. "When do you have the time?" "I'm not doing anything right now," Daimen said, shaking his head and rising to his feet. "Let's go. The sooner we get this over with, the sooner I can get back to my work in Orissa." Zorian almost felt bad for his older brother. The demonstration Zorian planned to give was just a beginning. There would be no peaceful routine for Daimen in this restart, at least if Zorian was successful in convincing him he was telling the truth. Almost. But not quite. I thought you said you were taking a break from work, Zorian pointed out. Shut up, Daimen responded. You know what I mean. He's working with his fiancée, said Zack with a lecherous smile on his face. I'm sure it's hard, physical labor. Daimen muttered something about teenagers but otherwise didn't comment on Zack's assertion. Do we need to leave the Terramachula estate for this? Daimen asked. If you end up causing another scene by triggering the defensive wards or something, I'll be pretty cross with you. Zorian hummed thoughtfully. Most wards were not made with detecting gate creation in mind, but one could never know for sure what an unknown warding scheme would react to. Not without launching into an extensive analysis of the wards themselves, which could itself trigger something and raise the alarm. Without knowing how the local wards were laid out and what their sensitivity thresholds were, Zorian could only advocate caution. As such, the group left the estate, leaving a message with the guards that they'd be back in a bit. Unsurprisingly, that would turn out to be a huge understatement. It was probably fine, though Zorian had seen the look the Terramachula guards gave Daimen when he said he'd be back before they know it, and he had a feeling this wasn't the first time Daimen pulled this sort of thing. Maybe asking himself what Daimen saw in Orisa was the wrong thing to ask. A better question was, what the hell did she see in him? Zorian sat on one of the hills overlooking Scioria, observing the city. Or at least pretending to do so in reality. Most of his attention was on Daimen, who was standing beside him and staring at the city in utter silence. Zack was lying on the grass next to them, whistling some annoyingly catchy tune and tracing outlines in the clouds with his finger, not even pretending that the city interested him. The whole situation was a strange sight to Zorian's eyes, and not really how he had expected the situation to develop once they brought Daimen back to Eldamar. When the group had been back in Koth, and Zorian proceeded to cast the gate spell successfully, he had expected Daimen to do something. Be shocked, or at least surprised. Maybe even become aggressive towards them, demanding an explanation or doubting their identity again. At the very least, he expected his brother to be visibly incredulous at the feat and have trouble deciding how to respond. Instead, Daimen just got very quiet and serious, not saying much and observing everything around him with uncommon intensity. He cast a number of spells that looked fairly exotic to Zorian's eyes, but which he suspected were meant to tell him whether or not he was stuck in an illusion, detect if his mind was being tampered with, and reveal any hidden presences lurking around them. That done, he cast the mind blank spell on himself, followed by 3 different privacy wards, and then threw some kind of metal sphere through the dimensional passage. Some kind of remote magical sensor, obviously. Only once the sphere told him there was no obvious trap around the Eldamar side of the gate did he agree to cross over. Seeing Zorian's simulacrum upon arrival made him frown, but he did not comment upon it. In fact, he did not comment much on anything that happened since then, opting to just silently scrutinize everything. Zack and Zorian teleported him around Eldamar for a bit, just to drive home the point that yes, they really did open a passage straight back home, and then brought Daimen here to this hill when they realized the man was just passively following after them and not reacting to things. Frankly, Zorian was getting a little concerned there. They had been on this hill for half an hour now, and Daimen was just standing there like a statue, staring at the city with this weird glassy expression. Did they break Daimen or something? Talk to us, Zorian finally said, not able to restrain himself any longer. Zack stopped whistling for a moment and inclined his head towards them, waiting to see whether Daimen would react. He did. As if woken from a dream by Zorian's statement, he took a deep breath and slowly turned in place until he faced Zorian. Who are you really? Daimen asked curiously. His voice was calm and unhurried, but Zorian could detect an undercurrent of frustration and anger lurking there. He may have mind blanked himself, but Zorian had years of experience of reading people's emotions and matching them to their facial expressions and mannerisms. I'm Zorian, of course, he told Daimen, equally calm and unhurried. He had expected this might happen. If a person you know suddenly got impossibly good at something or developed mastery in brand new fields out of the blue, it was reasonable to decide they could be possessed or an impersonator. "No, you're not," Diamond said lightly, shaking his head. "Zorian is too young to be capable of all this. My brother works hard and is almost as smart as me, but he just didn't have enough time to get this good. So you can't be him. Who are you and why did you go to the trouble of setting this up?" Zorian had half a mind to dispute this assertion that he was almost as smart as Diamond, but he had to be honest and admit that Diamond was, if anything, being overly generous there. Things never came to Zorian as naturally as they did to Diamond. "Why are you so calm if you think I'm someone other than your brother?" Zorian asked curiously. "If I thought Curiel was replaced with an imposter while I wasn't looking, I sure as hell wouldn't be calm about it." Diamond frowned at his mention of Curiel. Maybe he didn't know that Zorian was supposed to watch over her while their parents went to Koth. It was rather unexpected of him to agree to that, so maybe Mother never notified him of that little fact. "I'm calm because raging at you would solve nothing," Diamond said. "I need answers, and I doubt I could force them out of either of you two. You are a mage capable of creating simulacrums, teleporting across the country at whim and opening gates to another continent. Your friend here has been more low-key, but his relaxed manner makes me think he's actually the more dangerous of the two of you." "Indeed," Zorian commented. "I don't know, Zorian, I think a lot of people would be way more terrified of you than they would be me," said Zack, still lying around on the grass, completely ignoring the tense situation developing beside him. "So I can do little except try and see what you want and hope that Zorian is still alive," Diamond concluded, ignoring the comment. "I see," Zorian sighed. "I suppose it's not too surprising for you to reach this conclusion from where you're standing. However, you are wrong. I am Zorian. Your logic makes sense, but only if you make certain assumptions about the passage of time involved." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Diamond said, frowning. "Stop trying to sound mysterious and explain yourself." "Very well," Zorian said. "The truth is that it has been a while since we last saw each other, brother. It might seem like I'm implausibly capable, but it took me almost 6 years, instruction from experts that most people don't have access to, and enough money to finance a small country for a year to get this good. I'm 6 years older than I should be, but I'm still Zorian." "That's ridiculous," Diamond said. But there was a sliver of doubt in his voice. Or was it hope? He probably didn't want to believe Zorian had been replaced by someone. "So was our claim that we made a dimensional doorway across continental distances," pointed out Zack. "And yet we're here, aren't we?" "That's different," Diamond protested. "At least that's theoretically possible. I can't think of a way this could work. You can't just add an extra 6 years of life to a person without anyone noticing anything. Not even the best time dilation chambers could give him that. Besides, he implied he was interacting with the world at large while he lived out those 6 years, so time dilation couldn't be what he's talking about. Where does that leave us?" "It leaves us with a world in which time repeats itself," Zorian told him. "On the eve of the summer festival, everything is reverted to the start of the month. All that you did in the previous month is undone, and you forget. Everyone forgets. You lived through this exact same month so many times, making the same motions, same decisions, oblivious to this time loop that the world is bound in. Well, at least Zorian assumed so. Any changes in a given restart could be somehow traced to actions of either him or Zack, and surely none of their actions thus far were big enough to propagate all the way to Koth, right? We remember, though," Zorian continued. "We can advance our skills across restarts and learn from our mistakes. Which is how I got as good as I did in such a seemingly short amount of time. You're telling me I've been essentially doing nothing for the past 6 years?" Diamond asked him incredulously. "Try several decades," Zack said. 6 years ago is when Zorian ended up gaining the ability to retain skills and memories across restarts. The time loop has been going on for decades before that, though. Diamond looked like he was going to say something but then started pacing around the grassy hill instead, mumbling something unintelligible to himself. Seeing how they were back to waiting for Diamond to snap out of it again, Zack just shrugged and went back to tracing the shapes in the clouds again. After about 5 minutes, Diamond suddenly stopped and approached Zorian again. "I'm not saying I believe you," he began hesitantly. "Because I don't. It's crazy. But I'm willing to hear you out in more detail." "Fair enough," Zorian nodded solemnly. He cupped his hands in front of him and created an illusionary image of a slowly spinning planet in front of him. Above the planet was a simple drawing of an upturned triangle connected to a single horizontal tine through its tip. In the beginning, there was just the world we all lived on and an ancient artifact called the Sovereign Gate. The pretty illusions and the detailed story did not convince Diamond that their story was true. Not fully, anyway. He was forced to admit that Zorian probably was who he said he was, if only because he knew too many random details about their childhood days, but he found the time loop to be quite a crazy idea. There were not a whole lot of other answers that would explain things, though, so Zorian was hoping it wouldn't be long before he fully accepted things. It helped that he had introduced Diamond to Svim and Alanik, who were somehow more convincing to Diamond than his own brother. If Zorian was interpreting things correctly, Diamond found him pretty unnerving now, which was both kind of annoying and kind of flattering. But no matter, while Diamond was busy coming to terms with the truth of the world, other preparations and operations continued unimpeded. The Silent Doorway adepts were finally convinced to give them a chance in this restart too, and Zorian threw himself into the task of helping the Urania understand their Bakura Gate better. There was also the vague plan of transporting some of their mages to distant Bakura Gates in order to obtain their gate keys for future restarts, but that was still in the beginning stages. The time to take advantage of the black room beneath Scioria also came and went, and this time Zack and Zorian were no longer the only people inside. Kale and Svim also joined them. Kale couldn't exactly practice his alchemy inside the black room, but he wanted time to rewrite and reorganize his research notes a little, since their size and the haphazard manner in which they were written were making the whole thing gradually unmanageable. He claimed it took him most of the restart thus far just to figure out what he did in the past and how to build up upon it. As for Svim, he was switching his time between prodding Zack and Zorian whenever he felt they were slacking off and experimenting with various shaping regimens. Like Kale, he also had a mountain of notes, but he claimed there was no need for him to rewrite and organize anything. Perhaps it was because he was older and more experienced with note-taking, or maybe he just read fast and had an absurdly good memory, but he had no problem with quickly absorbing the notes that Zorian gave him at the start of each restart. Alanik and Taven declined to participate. Alanik claimed there was no point in him being there, while Taven said she didn't want to be stuck in a tiny little room with 4 men for a month. Which was fair enough. He really should have thought of that before he even brought the idea up for her consideration. Zack commented, with a suggestive grin, that he wouldn't mind giving up his spot in one of the future restarts so Zorian and Taven could have the black room all to themselves, to experiment. Thankfully, Taven took it in good humor and just rolled her eyes at him. It was not long after they returned from the black room that Zorian finally succeeded at something that had been bothering him for quite a while now. "I did it," he exclaimed, barging into Zack's room one day. "I finally succeeded." He was greeted with the sight of Zack sitting on the floor in front of one of the Urania that the Silent Doorway adepts had sent to Scioria to act as their representative. Zorian had placed telepathic relays between Scioria and their main colony, making such an arrangement less problematic than it would otherwise be. Normally, finding Zack talking to one of the Urania without Zorian being present would be quite an unusual sight. The Urania didn't have much respect for a non-psychic like Zack, and Zack didn't tolerate their condescension well. However, Zorian could identify the Urania in question at a glance, thanks to one of her main eyes being covered with a milky white membrane, having been ruined in some magical accident in her youth. Frozen thought spanning across bottomless chasms was somewhat deviant by Iranian standards, and held a deep fascination for non-psychic beings and how they perceive the world. Zorian suspected it had something to do with her sight being crippled at a relatively young age, and the wider Iranian philosophy of considering non-psychic beings as fundamentally crippled. Regardless, Frozen Thoughts was one of the rare Irania Zorian met over the restarts who actively preferred interacting with Zack over him, and it wasn't unusual to see her seek him out, even when she had no official business to bring up. Zorian wasn't entirely sure why Zack was so willing to indulge Frozen Thought's curiosity, when he clearly didn't think much of Irania in general. Perhaps he just found the situation novel enough to be interesting, or maybe he was just too polite to tell her off, but he treated Frozen Thoughts with a surprising amount of understanding and patience. "Well," Zack said. "Congratulations, I guess. What exactly did you succeed at?" "I found a way to open the secret research facility hidden in the ceiling of the Sciorian web," Zorian said. "Without destroying any of the contents, I mean." "Oh," Zack said, sitting up a little straighter. "Anything interesting?" "I'm still going through it all, but at first glance most of it seems to revolve around their efforts to translate human magics into forms more compatible with the Irania," Zorian said. "Makes sense," Frozen Thought said. "Isn't that the whole point of living beneath Scioria? At least for us Irania." "Right," Zorian said. "Well, that means that little of it will be useful to me directly, but I may have struck gold here regardless. I think the other Iranian webs are going to be very interested in this. With the kind of knowledge in my arsenal, I might be able to arrange for heavier concessions from the Iranian webs we meet. Maybe I can even talk them into teaching me some of their really good stuff, and then use that to get more really good stuff out of other webs and so on. I'm amused that you feel comfortable discussing a plot like that right in front of me," Frozen Thought said. "But I can't really blame you. My web would have probably been even more ruthless about taking advantage of that kind of opportunity if they were in your situation." "That's interesting to hear," Zack said speculatively. "Perhaps we might delegate some of our skill gathering to your web, then. Zorian is understandably a little skittish of going full raider on your people, but if we were to supply you with a bunch of secret Iranian techniques and equipment and left it up to you how you use them to acquire more, well, I'm sure that Zorian wouldn't inquire too deeply about the methods you used in your dealings." "I'm right here, Zack," Zorian complained. "So was Frozen Thoughts when you explained your master plan, but that didn't stop you," Zack grinned. "Besides, I feel most of the Iranians we met think a little too highly of themselves and could do with a little humbling." "I'm going to put this topic off for now," Zorian said. "Anyway, I did find one thing in the research facility that could be interesting. The web actually had a whole project dedicated to trying to adapt some of their mental techniques to human psychics. The idea, as far as I can tell, was to create a limited skill set for a sort of human vassal. They didn't call them that, of course, but that's kind of what it amounts to. The psychic would get instruction from them, the sort they cannot really get anywhere else, and in return they would serve as the Iranian spokesperson and, in their own words, a problem solver. There would be no coercion or mind-bending involved here. The documents were quite clear on that, as the web leadership wanted everything to be completely aboveboard if one of the psychics was subjected to mental examination and other scrutiny. The psychics would be kept in line through a simple thread of withdrawing support and teaching assistance to anyone who doesn't cooperate. And possibly legal persecution, since they intended to implement this only after they worked out some kind of formal deal with the Sciorian administration. So almost exactly like those mages and families that swear fealty to established houses, Zack noted. "Yes, that is probably where they got the idea," Zorian confirmed. "That's why I called them vassals. Anyway, most of these skills are too rudimentary for someone like me. I'm already too good at telepathy, mind reading, mental combat and the like to benefit from the bulk of the program." However, the web was also experimenting with providing the most loyal of these vassals mental techniques like those used by Iranian elders to enhance their thinking. "I'm still poring over the information, but the research notes seem pretty complete. The Sciorian web seems to have documented a lot of the obvious dangers and pitfalls involved in adapting these kinds of inner techniques to human minds. With access to this, I might actually be able to start tinkering in this field without doing something irreversible to myself. They must have left quite a trail of insanity behind them with such experimentation, Frozen Thoughts speculated. Tinkering with that kind of thing produces a lot of complications even in our own communities. Trying to adapt these techniques to human minds probably involved a lot of dramatic failures. The documents never say what happened to the humans involved with the experimentation, but I suspect you are right, Zorian nodded. If you want my advice, I suggest you start dabbling in this field by going to the Perfect Phantasm Crafters, Frozen Thoughts told him. Them? Zorian asked, surprised. I didn't know they were experts on these kind of techniques. They aren't, Frozen Thoughts said. But pretty much all Iranian webs have some measure of expertise in these, and the Perfect Phantasm Crafters are one of the webs with better understanding of the differences between human and Iranian minds. Additionally, their brand of inner techniques is relatively safe and inoffensive. They focus on the so-called self-illusions. Techniques that leave most of your thoughts untouched, merely altering how you perceive the world, highlighting some things in your vision, blocking out sounds, and so on. On the face of it, the idea of deliberately deceiving yourself may seem kind of dubious, but it can be very useful and it's easily undone. If you want to get started on this without risking insanity, the Perfect Phantasm Crafters are probably your best bet. After some more questions about the matter, Zorian left Zack and Frozen Thoughts to whatever discussion they had been having before he had barged in and left. He had too many things to worry about in the current restart to start an extensive new project like this, but it was something to think about in the future. So what do you think of the Pteromatula? Daimen asked. Zorian glanced at his brother, trying to decipher why he had suddenly asked him that question. Like usual, Daimen always had a mind blank on when he knew Zorian was around. In the beginning he had dropped that thing once he had realized he was really his brother and not some imposter, but when he later found out that Zorian was a mastermind mage he started zealously applying it on himself whenever they met. Since Daimen was clearly so paranoid about mind magic, Zorian had held off on confronting him about his own psychic nature and how much he really knew about it. Besides, Daimen was still reeling from the realization that he was just a copy in an endlessly repeating pocket universe, so he felt it would be a little bit mean to dump too many things on him at once. He had time. That particular question wasn't very time critical. Currently the two of them were taking a slow walk across the outer boundaries of the Pteromatula estate, ostensibly to just enjoy the view but actually so they could have a conversation without fearing someone would eavesdrop on them. Zack was not present at the moment, since Daimen requested this to be a private meeting between the two of them. Instead, he stayed behind in the central building of the estate, exchanging stories with the tutor that the Pteromatula had provided to both of them free of charge. After the relatively embarrassing showing he and Zack had during their initial reception, the Pteromatula decided they really needed a lesson in the local language and customs. Especially since it soon became obvious that the two of them would be visiting their place quite often in the near future, due to their frequent meetings with Daimen. The estate itself was quite large, with a massive central building ringed by a multitude of smaller ones. At least a quarter of the smaller buildings housed bees instead of people. All of the structures were sparkling white, not because they were painted such and kept clean, but because they were built using some kind of pearly white stone that didn't seem to get dirty. The central building had more color, though, being obviously intended as more ostentatious and eye-catching. Colorful, complicated braids and geometric shapes framed all of the doors and windows, and zigzagged across open walls. They weren't painted on either, and instead seemed to be made out of semi-precious stones and magical crystals embedded straight into the structure of the walls. Zorian wasn't sure, but they may have doubled as reinforcement for the building's warding scheme, so there was a possibility they weren't just ornamental. Pteromatula were also very fond of statues, most of them depicting stern-looking people that were presumably prominent ancestors of the family, but there were also a fair number of ones depicting various magical creatures. And giant bees, of course. What would a bee-focused family of mages do without statues of giant bees? All of the statues were carved and painted to be as lifelike as possible. The people of Koth were very fond of realism in art, and Terramachula were no exception. "They're surprisingly hospitable and friendly," said Zorian. "I expected them to be more arrogant and conceited, considering their status." "This is actually pretty typical of how most minor nobles behave," Daimen told him. "I interacted with a lot of them over the years, and they're rarely overtly unpleasant. Even if they think you're beneath them, they will rarely let that show unless you go out of the way to annoy them in some fashion." "I concede to your expertise in the matter, then," Zorian shrugged. "Anyway, I kind of like them." "I'm glad," Daimen said. "I guess you'd have no issue with taking my side when mother and father come, then?" Zorian gave him an incredulous look. "What?" Daimen asked defensively. "You think my opinion actually matters to them?" Zorian asked, raising his eyebrow at him. For that matter, he was surprised that Daimen cared about his opinion either. "But sure, throw my support of you right into their face if they ask. Not like their opinion of me could get much lower." "Zorian, that's a little too harsh towards your parents, don't you think?" Daimen tried. "Nope," Zorian answered unrepentantly. "I never mattered to them. Not until you made it clear you have no intention of settling down and taking over their family business, and Fortov showed them what a failure he really is. Then they expected me to drop all of my dreams and plans and remake myself into what they needed me to be." Daimen was quiet for a while. "I see," he eventually said. "You were so reasonable and calm during our meetings that I almost forgot what a perpetual ball of anger and resentment you tend to be." "Screw you too, Daimen," Zorian told him simply. "What exactly did you bring me here for, anyway?" "Well, first of all I wanted to say I'm very impressed with what you've achieved so far," Daimen began. Zorian gave him a strange look. Daimen was praising him. What the hell was going on here? "Don't look at me like that," Daimen protested. "I really am. 6 years is not that long in the grand scheme of things. You're still effectively a year younger than me, yet you've accomplished so much. I think that most people, even if they were handed the same opportunity as you, wouldn't have gotten as far in such a short period of time." Zorian stayed silent for a few seconds, unsure how to respond to that. "Thanks, I guess," he finally said. "Does that mean you accept the time loop as real now, then?" "Yes," Daimen nodded. "I guess I do." "In that case, I'm going to be frank with you," said Zorian. "We originally sought you out because we need your help with something." "Of course you do," Daimen said matter-of-factly. "A treasure hunt of some sort, I'm guessing?" "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "Remember what I told you about the third time traveler and how he stranded us all here? Well, there is potentially a way for us to unlock the exit. However, to do that we need to gather 5 pieces of the key that holds dominion over the sovereign gate. And one of these pieces is supposed to be lost here in Koth." Daimen listened to his explanation very calmly at first, nodding slightly here and there to indicate agreement and that he was paying attention, but then he suddenly flinched and straightened his back, as if struck by some realization. "Wait, the sovereign gate is an ancient imperial artifact?" Daimen exclaimed. Zorian looked at him like he had gone mad. "Well, yes," he said slowly. "Which means these keys you're looking for are probably also ancient imperial artifacts," Daimen concluded. "Yes," Zorian confirmed, still not understanding why Daimen seemed so animated about this. "The ring, the crown, the dagger, the orb and the staff of the first emperor of Icosia. Supposedly, the orb has been lost here in Koth. One of the emperors personally led an invasion force into the region to conquer it, but the army was scattered and driven deep into the jungles, where most of them perished. Including the emperor, whose body and possessions were never found. And he was reportedly carrying the orb with him at the time, so." Zorian stopped talking because Daimen began to laugh, first quietly and then progressing into a full-blown maniacal cackling. Seriously, what was wrong with him? Daimen? He asked uncertainly. Of course. Of course. Daimen said. As if that explained anything. It all comes back to this in the end, doesn't it? I don't suppose you're going to tell me why this is so funny to you. Zorian asked him, voice laced with annoyance. Because, my dear little brother, Daimen told him, that orb is what I'm after, too. Historically, Koth had been a frequent target for Icosian expansionism. The jungles that covered the region were dangerous to traverse and hard to clear, but they held valuable resources that couldn't be found anywhere else. This made Kothic societies developed and wealthy enough that nobody would scoff at conquering them, yet left the region as a whole politically disunited and fragmented. Thus, Icosian rulers often tried to bring the region under their thumb, reasoning that a bunch of bickering city-states and small kingdoms could not possibly unite together in time to repulse them. But such initiatives were never successful. Koth was very far from Icosian heartland, over rather inhospitable terrain, and fielding significant armies there was very hard. Additionally, the states of Koth proved quite willing to temporarily set aside their differences in order to resist Icosian incursions into the region. One of these unsuccessful campaigns, one that failed particularly dramatically, was the one launched by Awantemi. He was one of the more successful Icosian emperors, but his success was built upon many small successes and the gradual prosperity of the empire under his reign. He had no grand feats to his name, and he feared his rule would be forgotten as soon as his corpse cooled. Thus, he set his sights on the one thing he felt would immortalize his rule for all time. By conquering Koth, something that his predecessors had repeatedly failed at, he would acquire the glory he craved and prove himself an emperor worth remembering. It helped that Koth was being increasingly united by the rapidly growing League of Sawosi at the time, fueling fears that Koth might coalesce into a real competitor to the empire if allowed to develop unchecked. The campaign was a failure. Sure, the Icosian armies had their successes in the beginning, and most historians agree that the war was a close one until the very end. But what does that matter when the last battle had been such a spectacular loss for the Icosians? Frustrated by the slow progress of the campaign and by the very real possibility he would be returning home in failure, Awantemi assumed personal command of the army and led it straight into a trap the League of Sawosi had set up for him. The resulting battle was a total rout for the Icosian army, which was then forced to retreat deep into the dangerous jungles that made up the interior of the continent. Most of the force perished there, picked off by diseases, wildlife or environmental hazards. This included Awantemi himself, who would vanish without a trace somewhere in the trackless jungles. His corpse and belongings were never found, and the uncertainty of whether he was really dead or just missing would cripple attempts of his successor to assume the throne for quite a few years, leading to a period of great instability and turmoil for the empire. In a strange way, Awantemi had actually achieved the fame he had sought when he went to Koth. The campaign of conquest would become a popular cautionary tale against arrogance and glory-seeking, his name never to be forgotten. As for the League of Sawosi, they only had a short while to celebrate their victory. In order to fuel their war machine, they had taxed and arm-twisted their vassals and member states to such a massive extent that they revolted against the League the moment the Icosians had left. Its armies devastated by the war and its treasury empty, the League was unable to respond to this challenge against its authority and quickly fell apart. No other power would ever come as close to unifying Koth as the League of Sawosi had come before the war. Zorian was getting a little off track in his musings, though the important thing was that Awantemi had been carrying quite a few imperial treasures on him when he disappeared, and this possibly included the imperial orb. This was not actually stated anywhere in official Icosian history, which was very quiet about the fate of the orb, but several historians had noted that imperial chroniclers mysteriously stopped mentioning the orb in the aftermath of the campaign. It was likely that Awantemi's successors had been unwilling to admit that one of the artifacts of the first emperor had been lost in that campaign and had done their best to quietly sweep the issue under the rug by ignoring the orb's existence from that moment onward. In any case, attempts to locate Awantemi's final resting place were not exactly a rare occurrence. The orb aside, the rest of the treasures he had been carrying were a tempting prize on their own. None of these attempts were successful, but Zorian was armed with something none of the previous treasure hunters had had in their possession, an infallible way to detect the presence of the orb when at a considerable distance from himself, regardless of any wards or other obstacles that may be foiling mundane divination. "You have an inbuilt artifact detector," Daimen summarized, giving him a jealous glare. "Only in regards to a certain type of artifact, but yes," confirmed Zorian smugly. "I still need someone to point me in the right direction, of course. I was originally going to ask you for help in that regard. I mean, you're supposed to be this famous treasure hunter and all." "I am a famous treasure hunter," Daimen pointed out. "Right," Zorian nodded. "So I figured that you might be able to help me narrow down the search region faster. Give me a few tips, connect me to the right people, maybe even get personally involved. If you're already searching for the orb yourself, though, then everything just got a lot easier." Zorian was also reassured that someone had independently come to the same conclusion he and Zack had regarding the orb's location. It meant they probably weren't pursuing a fake lead. Daimen gave him an indecipherable look, staring at him in silence for a moment. Finally, he slowly shook his head and spoke. "I don't know whether I love you or hate you right now," he told Zorian. "On one hand, I have been stuck with this thing for months now, and it's driving me crazy. My own team had begun to lose faith in me and had started complaining about wasting time on this. You swooping in with a solution in hand is exciting, but a part of me is incensed that somebody else is going to hand me a solution to this search. It feels like you've just stolen some of my thunder, you know." Oh, Zorian knew that feeling very, very well. But no matter, the really interesting thing was that Damon's own team was starting to mutiny. That explained a lot about what was happening, honestly. Such as why Daimen was currently inside the Terramachula estate instead of out there in the field, trying to find the orb as soon as he could. "Is that why you decided to take a break from everything for a while?" Zorian asked. "To give your team a chance to calm down a little?" "Ugh," Daimen said, grimacing. "Sometimes you're too perceptive for your own good, Zorian. Yeah, I wanted to keep going, but they were being a big bunch of babies and complaining about sleeping in the jungle for several weeks and whatnot. Eventually we got into a bit of an argument and things got too heated for my liking, so I decided to give everyone some rest until I could rethink my approach." From what Daimen had told him and Zack earlier, Daimen had had his team focus on one specific area of the jungle for a while now, since he was sure he'd had the right spot identified. Meaning that he was probably telling them to comb through the exact same area over and over again with no results. Zorian wasn't surprised that they'd eventually lost their patience. "Anyway," continued Daimen, "give me a few days to gear up and organize everyone again, and we can go see if that detector of yours is as good as you say." "Wait, you're taking your entire team with you?" Zorian said, frowning. "Why? Can't we just pop over there quickly and check things out?" "No, because it's a huge area covered in dense, monster-infested jungle," Daimen told him. "I can only teleport us to a few places there in a safe and reliable manner. The rest of the way we'll have to walk, and I don't feel safe doing that with only 3 people. I'm good, and I'm guessing you and Zack are too, but that's not enough. Even the best mage is vulnerable to surprise attacks, and there is plenty of opportunity for that here." "I thought you said you had it narrowed down to one spot," Zorian pointed out curiously. "Well, relative to the huge swathes of jungle that cover the entire region?" "Yeah, I did," Daimen said, a little defensively. "It's still a lot of ground to cover, though. Why do you think I've been stuck on this for this long?" Zorian was about to try and argue that everything would still be so much faster if it was just the 3 of them, but Daimen cut him off with a warning stare. "Look," Daimen said, "I know you're on a time limit here, but be reasonable. It's a dangerous land full of chameleon drakes, devourer mantises, howlers, thorn swallow flocks and gods know what else. Stumbling about in haste will see us all killed in a matter of hours. Besides, Orissa is going to kill me if I try to do this without her, and my team will be waiting for their turn right behind her. They were a part of this from the start. I would end up looking like a petty glory hound if I cut them out of the endeavor just before we claim the prize. I'm not wrecking my reputation like that. I'm sure you can spare a day or two on this. And that was how Zack and Zorian found themselves searching for the orb of the first emperor with Daimen, Orissa and 15 other people. When Zorian had conceded to Damon's request to organize a full-fledged expedition for the orb, he'd known the whole endeavor was bound to turn into something of a spectacle. He had been absolutely right about that, but he had also completely misjudged what would cause it. He had thought the situation would gradually develop as he and Zack were forced to reveal their capabilities, piece by piece, during the course of the expedition. What actually happened was that Daimen outright told people that his little brother was secretly a master mage that rivaled him in skill, that Zack was similarly talented, and that the two of them had found some kind of imperial seal that let them detect other imperial artifacts nearby. This wasn't really what Zorian had had in mind when Daimen had told him that he would handle explanations and that Zorian needn't worry about thinking up an excuse for his powers. He was tempted to ask Daimen why he didn't tell them all about the time loop too, but he was afraid that the madman might actually go for it. How the hell did Daimen think this was a good solution to the problem? Daimen also decided, without even bothering to consult with Zorian, that field deployment would happen via gate usage. Daimen would teleport to the target area on his own and then coordinate with Zorian to open a dimensional passage between the Terramachula estate, where the rest of the team would be waiting, and their destination. This would admittedly speed things up considerably, since not everyone in the group could teleport and there were a lot of supplies to transport as well, but it meant revealing to the whole group that Zorian could open gates. Daimen saying that Zorian was a master mage is one thing, and might be passed off as Daimen being biased in favor of his family, but a mage that could open gates at Zorian's age naturally raised a lot of eyebrows. Annoyingly, everyone seemed to quietly accept that Daimen could cast the gate spell, even though the only reason he had that capability was because Zorian had taken the time to teach it to him in this restart. He normally wouldn't have bothered with that, but entering a black room had severed him from his simulacrums outside of it, dispersing them in very short order. This meant that he would have to keep sending simulacrums on a multi-day journey to Koth every time he emerged from one, which was annoying and quite impractical. As such, he decided to try and teach the gate spell to Daimen so he could open the gate to Koth with his help. Fair is fair, though it took only 2 days for Daimen to learn the spell, which was kind of amazing. He was already extremely good at dimensionalism, it turned out, having done the relevant shaping exercises and practiced with various types of teleportation. He had simply never found anyone willing to teach him the actual spell. Experts that could cast the gate spell were very rare and they didn't share that kind of magic with others lightly. Not even if the person was a famous treasure hunter like Daimen. In any case, Zorian was more than a little annoyed at how Daimen had handled the expedition preparations and thus decided to vent a little by showing off more than he had initially planned. He took 4 of his combat golems, which he had been mass-producing in preparation for the assault on the Abasin Gate beneath Scioria, and brought them with him to the expedition as his bodyguards. He probably didn't need them, but the look on Damon's face when he stomped into the Terramachula estate with 4 golems in tow was priceless. It would also serve as a useful test of how his golems handled unfamiliar environments, he supposed. Finally, the gate was opened and 19 people, plus 4 golems, entered the area that supposedly held the orb, a dense, shadowy patch of jungle known to the locals simply as Diherna. Green Hell. A simple, but apt description, one of Damon's team members told him. He was an older, weathered-looking man that served as the group's main ward expert. Both in making and breaking them. I've been in more dangerous places, but this one is near the top of the list. Try to stay near the center of the group. You and your buddy may be good, but some things can only be acquired with age. Zorian had been rather dismissive of the man's words at the time, since the weathered old mage obviously did not know the full story about him and Zack, but he would soon learn there was some wisdom to be found in the old man's words. The vegetation alone was a huge obstacle to exploring the area. There were no jungle trails crisscrossing the place, and the lack of sunlight made the area shadowy and dim, making it hard to spot dangers and navigate through the foliage. Zorian's mind sense helped there, allowing him to sense the minds of predatory animals with relative ease, but not every danger had a thinking mind behind it. Some of the vegetation was mobile and predatory, for instance, but not especially intelligent. Zorian found that out the hard way when a tangle of jungle vines wrapped themselves around him and tried to drag him off into a pit when he got a little careless. Thankfully, his golem bodyguards managed to fight them off long enough for Zorian to clear his head and ignite the air around himself, forcing them to back off. "You are lucky," the weathered mage told him afterwards. "That fissure vine was a young one. Older ones grow razor-sharp thorns along their length. I'm sure you can imagine what would have happened to you if one of those got a hold of you. Though admittedly, older fissure plants are easier to spot than young ones." How embarrassing. Still, at least he knew that he had made the bodyguard golems correctly. They had reacted quickly and precisely to the crisis and managed to keep the plant from dragging him off without breaking his bones in the process. Making golems that knew how to hold back their full strength like that was pretty hard, Zorian had found. Zorian conceded the man's point after that and did not stray from the main group too much. Zack, on the other hand, did not let that incident scare him off. He wandered around the area freely, unconcerned with the various dangers crawling about the place. Zorian supposed that Zack had a good reason to be so fearless, considering he had literal decades of experience at adventuring in dangerous environments, unlike Zorian. "Stop!" Zorian called out to the group. They all obeyed him. He knew that some of the people gathered here looked down on him because of his age and perceived nepotism, but nobody doubted his ability to detect danger anymore. He pointed at the area slightly to the right of the group. 2 chameleon drakes up ahead. Big ones. Chameleon drakes were the primary danger of the area. They were tough, agile, fast, could change the color of their hide so rapidly they were virtually invisible to the human eye, and routinely reached about 3.5 meters in length. They also sometimes hunted in groups, and had no compunctions about preying on humans. Green hell was absolutely crawling with them for some reason. Fortunately for the group, they had Zorian and his mind sense. Chameleon drakes might be a huge danger to most travelers, but to Zorian, their highly developed minds stood out like glittering stars in the night sky. The chameleon drakes were equipped with more than just speed, size and virtual invisibility, they were also quite intelligent by animal standards. On the verge of sapience, in Zorian's estimation. Maybe even there, to an extent. This was no doubt a boon against most opponents, and did much to explain how they could give seasoned mages so much trouble, but it made their ambushes painfully obvious to a psychic of Zorian's level. Upon hearing Zorian's warning, 3 people changed their stances and focused their attention on the area he indicated. One was Orissa, another was a young woman in bright blue clothes named Kerma, and the third was a burly bearded man named Torin. These 3 were the scouts of the group, scanning their surroundings for dangers, obstacles and even the orb itself. A bit pointless, that last one, but being told that Zorian can simply detect the presence of the orb from a considerable distance seemed to have awoken some kind of competitive spirit in the 3. Each of the 3 had their own methods of gathering information. Orissa's was through her bees, which she had scattered throughout the jungle around them. She carried on her back a huge backpack-looking thing that was actually a portable beehive. A constant stream of bees was constantly leaving the backpack under Orissa's direction or returning to it to report their findings. It looked pretty heavy, but Orissa was carrying it with practiced ease. Zorian was unsure whether that was because Orissa was stronger than she looked, or if the hive was lightened in some way. Orissa's bees looked fairly mundane to Zorian's amateur eyes. They didn't have any special mental signature either. Zorian had initially thought that maybe they were unified into some kind of collective, like the cephalic rats, but he found no evidence of that. He asked Orissa about them, and she admitted that the pteromatula couldn't actually access the senses of their bees directly. Instead, they had some method of talking to the bees and getting usable information in the process. Zorian could tell that whatever method the pteromatula used to direct and talk to their bees, it wasn't a structured spell. Orissa never did any chanting or gesturing, nor did she use any obvious spell aids. The process seemed to be almost like breathing to her, as evidenced by the fact she could direct her bees and talk to Zorian at the same time without any visible strain. Kerma, the blue-clothed woman, was probably the most mundane of the three scouting mages. She was clearly using classical scrying and other divinations for her work. What was noteworthy about her was the divination compass she was using. It was a large, heavy-looking, multi-layered contraption of brass and silver, its shape vaguely reminiscent of a lotus flower. The petals were densely inscribed with mysterious glyphs and shapes that Zorian found hard to puzzle out through casual inspection. The lotus device seemed to be highly effective, because Kerma was cycling through some rather complicated divinations with a speed that even Zorian would struggle to match. Finally, there was Torin. Torin was constantly surrounded by a swarm of eyes that floated around him, twitching to and fro as something caught their attention. Each one was differing in size and internal structure of the eye from the others, and they looked very lifelike. To be precise, they looked like they had been extracted from corpses of various magical beings famous for their visual powers and then preserved in some fashion. Which was probably exactly what happened. Zorian was about 90% sure that Torin couldn't actually see through all of his eyes. In fact, he suspected that the man was limited to rapidly cycling between them instead of being able to process visual information from multiple eyes at once. There also seemed to be some severe distance limitations involved, because he never sent them too far into the jungle to scout things. "You are once again correct," Orissa remarked after a while. "If I may ask, how are you detecting the drakes from such a distance? Is this also the work of this mysterious imperial inheritance you stumbled upon?" "No, it's just mind magic," Zorian said. He could tell most people suspected as much by now, so there was no need to be all secretive. A bunch of them had already cast some kind of mental defense spell on themselves when they thought Zorian wasn't looking. "It's something of a specialty of mine." "I see," Orissa said, nodding. "I did suspect this was the case." "Hey, little Kaczynski," Torin called out to him. Zorian gave him an annoyed glare. That seemed to be the newest name Damon's group had given him, and he hated it. "How good is that mind magic of yours? Do you think you could snare one of those drakes and bring him over?" An interesting question. Chameleon drakes had considerable magic resistance, but it was nothing absurd. He just might be able to subvert one and puppeteer it for a while. However, after he did some subtle probing of their minds. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not these ones, at least. They're a bonded pair, and would never abandon one another. I could dominate one of them perhaps, but the other would follow after them and defend them. Unnecessary fights will only slow us down," Diamond stated. "Leave the drakes alone, Zorian. Torin has enough eyes to play with, anyway." "You can never have enough eyes," Torin said. "But actually, I was after the beast itself this time." Chameleon drakes, much like their more mundane cousins, have the curious ability to move each of their eyes independently of one another and thus focus on multiple things at once. And they have 4 of them. I suspect I could learn interesting things from them. There is no shortage of chameleon drakes around here, the withered old mage from earlier said. The kid can get you one later. Preferably a young one, so it does less damage when it inevitably breaks out of its bindings and rampages throughout the camp. Don't even joke about that, Diamond told him. Anyway, we'll just go around them, IG-. No need, said Zorian. They're leaving. They've noticed that we've stopped walking for too long and found it suspicious, so they've called off the ambush. Even better, Diamond said, pleased. Onward we go, then. After a few minutes, Zack stopped his wandering and approached him. "I've thought of something," he said. "What if you shapeshifted into a bird and simply flew around for a bit? I bet you could cover ground pretty fast that way." "I'd be dead in a matter of minutes," Zorian said, shaking his head. He'd thought of that idea already and discarded it immediately afterwards. "The trees are pretty high here, and full of things that prey on birds. If I fly high enough to be safe, the ground would be beyond the marker's detection radius. If I fly low, I probably get eaten by something." "Ah," Zack winced. "Yeah, I didn't think of that. And now that I think of it, the orb could easily end up being underground. Probably the best place to get some safety in a place like this." "That's it!" Diamond shouted, hitting himself in the forehead. He had evidently been eavesdropping on their conversation, the jerk. "That's what I've been missing all this time. Underground. We should have been looking for the damn orb underground instead of simply searching through the foliage. I'm such an idiot." After that, Diamond called for everyone to stop and make a base camp so they could discuss things for a while. With this done, the group quickly came up with a plan to perform some kind of geomantic ritual spell that would map out the basic shape of the underworld and narrow down their search on that basis. Honestly, Zorian was feeling a bit lost there. He had studied many things over the course of the time loop, but ritual spells involving more than one caster were not one of them. He mostly kept to himself while the rest of the group was setting up the ritual. He thought about striking up a conversation with his fellow time traveler, but Zack seemed to be trying to hit on Kerma, so Zorian left him alone for now. Eventually, his solitude was broken when Diamond pulled him to the edge of the camp, where Orisa was already waiting, so that the three of them could have a conversation about something. Zorian already had a pretty good idea what this was about. "You're interested in my mind magic, aren't you?" Zorian asked Orisa, giving her a shrewd look. "Ah, well," Orisa fumbled slightly. "Was I that obvious?" "Yes, I must admit the topic intrigues me." "It's a personal secret," Zorian told her bluntly. "Zorian!" Diamond protested, jumping to his fiancée's aid. "But I might be willing to share some of it if Diamond agrees to honestly answer a few questions for me," Zorian said, turning towards Diamond with a cheery smile. "What kind of questions?" Diamond asked hesitantly. "Questions about your own mind magic," Zorian told him, his smile turning into a frown. "Questions like why you never told me I was a natural mind mage when I was a child. You had to have known, as a fellow natural mind mage, but you never said anything and left me to suffer alone." What?" Diamond said, erupting into a burst of outraged laughter. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I know you're like me, Diamond," Zorian told him. "I can sense it. And you can sense me as well." "No, I can't," Diamond protested, shaking his head vigorously. "Maybe I have a potential for the sort of mental bullshit you're capable of, but I was never taught how to do that. They told me I was an empath and taught me how to turn the ability on and off, and that's it, okay? I don't know what you're talking about. You're saying you never noticed anything unusual about me?" Zorian asked, frowning. "Well," Diamond laughed nervously. "I noticed you were very easy to read, but hell, that could have meant anything." "You suspected the truth," Zorian accused. "Okay, so I did," Diamond admitted. "But I couldn't be sure, and why out myself for a mere suspicion? Especially to a brother that hated me and constantly got me into trouble. And really, what if it was true? What of it? If you really were an empath like me, that only made your actions more baffling and annoying. What good is empathy like that with no control?" Zorian snapped at him. "I couldn't even walk into a crowd without consequences. If you had taken a bit of time to teach me how to turn it off, or at least told me what to watch out for, I wouldn't have been nearly as baffling and annoying as you thought I was." The discussion then degenerated into several moments of incoherent shouting and accusations before Orisa decided to act and stopped the argument by interposing herself in between them. Why don't we all take a break for a moment and calm down, Orissa said. Her bees synchronized their buzzing into an ominous hum. You two are just talking past each other at this point. You're making assumptions about each other that clearly aren't true. Zorian scoffed, and almost snapped at her as well for trying to use such petty intimidation tactics on him. As if he were afraid of a bunch of bees. Still, she kind of had a point that he and Daimen would probably be better served to sit down and have a more sedate discussion about the issue. Daimen backed down even sooner, too smitten with Orissa to really stand up to her on the issue. Having successfully defused the situation, Orissa then excused herself, claiming this was something they had to work out on their own and that she didn't want to intrude. Daimen tried to protest and keep her there, but Zorian was grateful for her action and gave her a small nod as she left. After a while, they started talking. As it turns out, Daimen had been empathic for as long as he could remember. His empathy was nothing like Zorian's, however. Daimen's empathy was weaker than Zorian's had been, but far more controllable. He never suffered any headaches in crowds, and he could focus it on specific people at will. He realized early on that this ability was something unique to him, and that he could get far more out of it if nobody knew he had it. Thus, he kept it a secret from everyone. During his time in the academy, he had realized that he was an empath and secured himself instruction from an older empath who had taught him how to turn his ability on and off and some minor tricks to improve its sensitivity and selectiveness. Daimen had never developed a proper mind sense, and couldn't identify other open people on sight like Zorian could. Even his empathy was crude and unsophisticated by Zorian's standards. I suspected you might be like me, Daimen said. But then again, your actions were kind of strange for someone who could sense people's emotions like I could, and that gave me pause. It never even occurred to me that your empathy might not work exactly the same as mine did. I still don't understand what went wrong in your case when my empathy was such a boon to me. Why didn't you say anything? I did, Zorian said. Mother and father said they would throw me in a madhouse if I didn't shut up about that topic. Ah ha ha, Daimen laughed nervously. I'm sure they were just joking around. You are way too sensitive about these things, Zorian. Zorian did not attempt to argue with him. Since their parents had always fawned on Daimen so much, he had a very skewed image of them. There was probably no helping that. Look on the bright side, though, Daimen continued, trying to change the topic. Since you had no preconceptions about your ability being empathy and thus limited to sensing emotions, you developed it into something far more amazing. I'm really jealous of that, to be honest. I didn't know there was more to my ability until I met Orissa and the Pteromatula. If the Pteromatula knew about Daimen's innate mind magic talent, it was no wonder they were so understanding about Orissa wanting to marry him. He was famous, good-looking, a mage prodigy and a natural mind mage. Truthfully, if Zorian was in Daimen's place, he would be wondering if Orissa ever actually loved him or was simply going after him out of sheer opportunism. What did Orissa want to talk to me about, anyway? Zorian asked. Oh. Well, I think you kind of already gave her an answer to that, Daimen said. She wanted to see if the mental ability you were using is the same one I have. Ah, I see, Zorian nodded. The Pteromatula are hoping it's inheritable, I'm guessing. Is it? Daimen asked. Probably, Zorian shrugged. I've heard that abilities like that never just spring out of nowhere in a child, and it's a bit of a stretch that the two of us have the same ability through luck alone. There is clearly some kind of inheritance thing going on, but it's hard to say whether your children would be guaranteed to inherit it. A lot of bloodlines aren't guaranteed for children to inherit in their raw state, Daimen said. There are often artificial methods of ensuring inheritance involved, such as specialized potions and rituals. I doubt the Pteromatula will care much. Any further discussion was interrupted when one of Daimen's teammates came up to them to notify them the ritual was ready, and that they were only waiting for Daimen. Alright, we'll continue with this topic some other time, Daimen said. For now, let's focus on finally tracking down that damn orb. Like many places, Green Hell had an extensive network of underground tunnels running beneath it. Indeed, the local underworld was unusually complex, which helped explain why the area was so rich in ambient mana and why it was so abundant in dangerous wildlife. Even if one limited themselves to surface layers of the dungeon, reasoning that Awantemti wouldn't have wanted to descend too far, that was a lot of tunnels to cover. Thus, when Damon's team presented them all with a three-dimensional illusion of the local underground, Zorian could only stare at it in confusion. How the hell does this information help them narrow down their search? They would still have to walk through most of the area to cover all the tunnels reasonably close to the surface. However, Daimen seemed to see something important in the floating image, because he soon pointed his finger at 5 places on the map. Here, 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 here and here, he said, poking the illusion in 5 different places, causing it to waver for a second before correcting itself. The spots looked completely random to Zorian. We should focus on these areas to start with. I don't understand, Zorian complained to Zack. On what basis is he picking those 5 places? He had been hoping that Zack, having decades of experience in adventuring, would see something in Damon's choices that he missed. His hopes turned out to have been misplaced, however. No idea, Zack told him. That map is a total mess to me. He's probably just bullshitting to make himself look more knowledgeable and experienced. I used to do that a lot when I ended up in charge of something. Never let your peons know you actually have no idea what you're doing. I can hear you two just fine, you know, Daimen told them in an annoyed tone. I wasn't trying to be quiet, Zack pointed out. Daimen didn't reply. Instead he simply pointed them towards the nearest of the 5 places and motioned for everyone to start moving. They were only halfway to the first spot when Zorian suddenly stopped. He had been spamming key detection requests to his marker on a regular basis as they walked, and now it actually reacted to something. He found the orb. It's here, Zorian said excitedly. What? What's here? Daimen asked in confusion. The orb, of course, Zorian said. Was he intentionally being stupid? It's here, I can sense it. Do you mean it's right below us, or, asked Zack, speculatively looking at the ground beneath his feet. Probably considering how best to excavate the huge amount of dirt between them and the nearest tunnel. No, but close, Zorian said, pointing towards the northeast. The group stared in the indicated direction for a while, as if that was going to help them see the orb through all the dirt and vegetation that was in the way. Is there anything notable in that direction? Daimen asked Kerma. She was the one who kept detailed maps of the region, stored in her Lotus device. She quickly consulted her device for an answer. Actually yes, there is, she said hesitantly. There is a chameleon drake nesting ground over in that direction. Because the place is so relatively prominent, it was one of the first places we checked. I remember now, Daimen said. Hasana insisted we check it out. Said that of course the orb is in the most dangerous place in the area, how could it be anywhere else? He pointed at the weathered old man who had advised Zorian caution earlier. And I was right, see? Hasana said. We should have looked harder. But I don't understand, Kerma protested. We searched that place. There is nothing there. We never actually set foot in the place, though, Torin pointed out. We just checked it out remotely. We were thorough, Kerma insisted. There was nothing there. Awantemti was traveling with his entire entourage when he disappeared and was carrying a hefty supply train. We saw no evidence that a group of that size perished there. It's been a long time since Awantemti walked the earth, Torin said, shrugging. And it's possible the fool got separated from his entourage and perished there alone. Maybe the orb is buried under some rock in one of the caves, and is protected against divinations. I suppose, Kerma reluctantly conceded. She seemed unwilling to admit she may have missed the orb in her earlier search. She probably saw it as a blow against her personal pride. A decision was made to make another attempt at searching the place. The group approached the nesting ground as close as possible without provoking the chameleon drakes into swarming them and then systematically scryed the place. The place was actually not that big. Neither the cenote itself nor the caves dug into its walls were connected to the dungeon, so there was only so much ground that their spells had to cover. Despite that, no amount of divinations, remote scouts and other information-gathering methods could find the orb. There was no evidence of any kind of treasure there. "It's definitely there," Zorian insisted stubbornly. He knew what his marker was telling him. "It's right there in that biggest cave near the bottom of the cenote, the one that looks natural instead of being artificially dug up by the chameleon drakes. We already searched that one 1,000,000 times with everything we could think of," Kerma said, sounding very annoyed with him. "Torin even risked sending one of his rarer eyes in there, the one that can see through solid objects. There is nothing there, okay? Your legacy is malfunctioning." Zorian sighed. There was no point in arguing about this anymore. "I need to get physical access to that cave," he told Zack. "I'm sure I can find it, but I need to be actually there, not watching things through a divination screen or a remote sensor." "Got it," Zack said, rising to his feet and dusting himself off. "I'll deal with the lizards, you just stay behind me and keep them from flanking me or something." "Not so fast, you two," Daimen told them. "Do you honestly think we would just stay on the sidelines and watch you either get horribly killed or claim the orb for yourselves? That's a lose-lose proposition. We came here together, and we'll execute this assault together as well." "This is stupid," Kerma complained. "We're doing it anyway," Daimen said. "If Zorian says the orb is there, it's there. However, let's not charge into the cenote like idiots. I'd rather induce them to swarm out and blunder into a trap. Here's what we're going to do." In the depths of the Gothic jungle, a fierce battle was raging. On one side there were nearly 100 chameleon drakes charging in defense of their homes and young, and on the other side was a group of 19 people that had brazenly thrown irritating gas into the cenote to flush them out. Though the chameleon drakes looked brutish, they were not dumb. They knew they were being provoked, but they also knew they had to answer this challenge. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to take their cenote habitat away from them, and it wouldn't be the last. Damon's group had set up a minefield between themselves and the cenote when they had provoked the chameleon drakes, but they had underestimated their opponents. Rather than launch a frontal charge at Damon's group, the chameleon drakes split their group into two halves and charged at them in two wide arcs, aiming to hit their flanks from both directions. One might think the drakes had spotted the trap and reacted accordingly, but Zorian could peer into their minds and knew they hadn't. Cold, hard experience had taught this particular group not to face their enemies head-on if they could avoid it, especially if they were human. The two groups crashed into each other and the chameleon drakes came out for the worse in the process. They were impressive beasts, fast and strong, but their strengths were most pronounced when attacking from an ambush. Their virtual invisibility did not work well if they were constantly on the move, and the lightning-fast tongue attack they liked to use as an opening strike was less effective on a creature that expected it. It didn't help that Damon's group had several powerful mages, including Zack. With a practiced movement, Zorian fired a glittering orange star at the chameleon drake in front of him. The large reptile reacted with impressive agility, throwing itself to the side to avoid the projectile and folding its front claws over its face to protect its eyes from the imminent explosion. And the explosion did come, just like the chameleon drake predicted, singeing its scales but not doing any truly critical damage. It landed right on its feet with the nimbleness of a house cat, its four conical eyes whirring around, each in its own direction, in an attempt to reorient itself. Finally, it fixed its front two eyes on Zorian, the other two eyes twitching about for any hint of an attack from behind, and it opened its large, toothy mouth wide open. It was the mistake that Zorian had been waiting for. He launched a force lance at the chameleon drake and then immediately followed it with a double-layered shield around himself, casting them so quickly that it almost appeared as if he cast two spells simultaneously. The chameleon drake shot its spear-like tongue at Zorian, punching through one layer of his shield but failing to penetrate the second. Before it could retract its tongue for another go, however, the force lance hit it straight in the throat through its open mouth, bypassing the tough scales that protected its body. The drake dropped on the ground immediately, kicking and thrashing about like it was having a seizure, kicking up plumes of dust in its death throes. Zorian spent a second to make sure it was down for good and then turned his attention to the rest of the targets. He was just in time to see Hasana stumble over an ill-placed rock and fall to the ground some distance away from him. His opponent, one of the slightly smaller chameleon drakes that only barely reached 3 meters in length, immediately took advantage of this to try and pounce at him. Fortunately, Zorian had his golems scattered through the entire group, and one was nearby. The golem, devoid of self-preservation and acting under Zorian's telepathic orders, launched itself at the chameleon drake with a full-body tackle. It crashed into the chameleon drake's flank, causing it to veer off course and giving Hasana enough time to recover and get back to his feet. "You okay, old man?" Zorian asked him, running up to him to make sure he didn't hit his head in the fall or something. The chameleon drake seemed to be busy slamming his golem repeatedly into the ground, outraged that its interference had costed it its kill. "I'm fine," he said, shaking his head. "How embarrassing. Here I am, lecturing the younger generation about the need for modesty and caution and whatnot, and then I make a stupid mistake like this. Bah. It's true as they say, you learn things all your life and still die a fool." Looking around the battlefield, Zorian realized that the chameleon drakes were getting beaten back at every front. On one side, Orissa was using her bees to attack the sensitive eyes of the drakes, making them flail around in panic as they attempted to dislodge such tiny opponents from themselves. Daimen and other members of his team then finished off the blinded drakes by focusing their fire on them one at a time. On the other, Zack disdained any sort of fancy tactics and simply used a pair of floating black swords to slice any chameleon drake that came close to pieces. The sword seemed to pass through the beast's tough hide without resistance, killing them instantly. The drakes eventually grew fearful to even approach him, choosing instead to pursue other targets. Soon, the chameleon drakes seemed to collectively realize that the confrontation wasn't going well for them and started to retreat. Amusingly, some of them chose to retreat directly through the minefield that they had missed in the initial charge, which resulted in another couple of fatalities among their number without Damon's group needing to do anything to make it happen. Only a few died before the rest learned to stay clear of that area, however. Taking stock of the situation after the battle, Zorian noted that no one in Damon's group died in the fighting, so this could be safely described as a resounding victory. Even though things could have gone a lot smoother than this, in his opinion. However, there was a problem. While the chameleon drakes retreated, they did not flee entirely. They simply withdrew towards the cenote and then stopped. They seemed unwilling to give up their home, even if they knew they were beaten. They started hissing loudly in their direction, puffing themselves up to look bigger and making threatening movement towards them. Are they trying to intimidate us or something?" Daimen asked incredulously. "I think so, yeah," Zorian said. "They lost a fight and now they're resorting to threats instead." "That's amusingly outrageous," Torin said. "I guess there is no harm in trying, from their perspective. If it works, great. If it doesn't, it was worth a try." The threatening display didn't dissuade them from advancing, of course. The orb was down there, so getting access to the cenote was a must. However, when they started moving towards the cenote again, the chameleon drakes changed their behavior. They stopped trying to intimidate them and instead threw their heads into the air and started to wail. Zorian did not know how to describe it. It wasn't really a wail in the human sense, but the sound was loud, repetitive and pitiful. And all the chameleon drakes were doing it in unison. It was like the entire group in front of them was cursing the heavens for abandoning them. "Damn, these things are actually making me feel sorry for them a little," Daimen complained. "I kind of feel like a villain here." "They're not crying," Zorian said, a terrible realization growing in the back of his head. They're calling for help. Summoning assistance. They're what? Daimen frowned. Kerma, can you check? The entire group stumbled as a tremor shook the earth beneath them, centered on the cenote. What the hell was that? Daimen demanded. It wasn't clear who he was talking to, but it was Kerma who eventually answered, after consulting her lotus device. The water in the cenote, she said. It's churning. Then Zorian felt it. Before, the cenote felt mostly dead to his senses, and even scrying from the group failed to locate anything of interest. Now, however, Zorian could feel a mind dwelling there. Something big, mean. And hungry. Okay, tactical retreat, Zorian said, gesturing everyone to start retreating from the cenote. He noticed that the chameleon drakes had stopped wailing and instead looked rather expectant and almost gleeful. We have something seriously big and hostile coming up from there. I think. He didn't have time to think. Something huge and dark blue unfolded itself out of the cenote. At first Zorian thought he was looking at some kind of animated tree or a giant sea anemone, but then the branches stilled for a second and it became obvious what he was looking at. It was a Hydra. A really, really big one. 8 draconic-looking heads observed the world around it with interest, eventually zeroing in on the group of humans in the distance. Its 8 mouths opened up slightly, exposing rows and rows of dagger-like teeth, and began to salivate. Oh, said Zack happily in the resulting silence, his eyes shining with a fire that Zorian rarely saw in him. Looks like I might have some actual fun here after all. As if reacting to his statement, the Hydra opened all 8 of its mouths and let loose a deafening roar.